In addition, if Fuchida's account is to be believed, several other individuals were present at least some of the time as well. Captain Oishi, Kusaka's senior staff member, Lieutenant C. Dr. Ono, Staff Intelligence Officer, Lieutenant C. Dr. Nishibayashi, Staff Flag Secretary, Commander Masuda, Akagi's Achik, and Fuchida himself. Of these, Oishi and Ono appear to have been present at all times. Fuchida apparently came and went at various points during the morning, and Nishibayashi was likely doing the same. Commander Masuda would perforce have been spending much of his time on the air control platform on the aft end of the island, one level lower, but would have been coming up to the bridge periodically to report to Captain Aoki on the state of air operations. In addition, a minimum of several enlisted personnel were required on the bridge for lookout duty and running messages. Taken together, it's difficult to imagine that there were fewer than a dozen individuals in the command spaces almost constantly. The men had to have been standing practically shoulder to shoulder, with Nagumo and his staff crammed into the starboard half of the bridge. Nagumo was unlikely to be able to give or receive candid opinions from his staff in such a setting. The Japanese, as a rule, do not like interpersonal confrontations and tend to shun uncomfortable social situations. Kusaka and Genda were undoubtedly sensitive to the fact that Nagumo was not as well versed in naval aviation matters as he needed to be. Yet, in such a setting, they probably would have been unwilling to make the full extent of their own knowledge known, because that would risk embarrassing their commander in front of Captain Aoki and the ship's crew. Nagumo, for his part, would certainly not have wanted to reveal his own shortcomings in these matters. In such a setting, it's difficult to construct a scenario wherein a truly fluid exchange of information was possible. Worse yet, there was no place Nagumo and his staff could retreat for some temporary privacy and still be in proximity to Akagi's command and communications equipment. Akagi's island was simply too small. These miserable arrangements stand in stark contrast to the facilities on board Iwu-2 American carriers, which were made possible by the American vessels having much larger islands. On each of the Yorktown-class ships there was a separate bridge for both the captain and the admiral. The ship's captain was not even allowed inside the admiral's bridge without an invitation from the flag. As such, an American admiral was free to discuss, debate, or flat-out argue with his staff members behind closed doors. They were shielded from the distracting hubbub of the ship's helm and watchman, allowing them to focus strictly on the management of the battle. The admiral had a sea cabin located in the island, allowing him to take naps if needed in order to maintain his alertness. In addition, American admirals often had their own separate radio facilities located nearby in the island as well. All of these were luxuries Nagumo could only have dreamed of in the Spartan and completely public setting of Akagi. It should be noted, too, that during much of the morning, Akagi was either being directly attacked or was under threat of same. During these periods, the ship was frequently maneuvering at high speeds. Nagumo had nearly been killed by a B-26 40 minutes earlier and would shortly witness several new attacks requiring additional defensive gyrations from his flagship, accompanied by cap actions and heavy anti-aircraft fire. Akagi was also conducting flight operations with some frequency. Stuck as he was in a cramped fishbowl, it's likely Nagumo spent a fair amount of his time looking out the window at these various happenings and trying to gauge their importance. In other words, the situation on the bridge was uncomfortable, noisy, and distracting in the extreme. Kusaka noted that even the ship's public address system was barely audible above the din. It's hardly surprising that in such a setting, Nagumo found it difficult to reason either quickly or clearly. Nagumo's third major constraint revolved around his deck operations. A solution for Nagumo had to proceed on the basis of what was actually possible on the flight decks. Down through the years, numerous commentators on the battle have offered facile solutions for Nagumo's conundrum that have ignored these very real limitations. For instance, why could not the Japanese have moved their strike force to the flight decks and then rolled the strike aircraft forward of the crash barriers to warm up while the morning strike was recovered? Then, after recovering Tomonaga's aircraft and striking them below, Why couldn't the strike aircraft, now presumably warmed up and ready for launch, be rolled back to the rear of the flight deck for spotting? The answer to questions like these is that some of these operations might have been technically possible, but the Imperial Navy had never tried doing any of them before. 0800 on 4th of June was a lousy time to try to figure out how. Militaries fight as they train. They absolutely have to, or they would descend into utter chaos when confronted by the enormous pressures of battle. Any attempt to monkey with fundamental activities as complex as deck operations was guaranteed to lead to confusion, wasted time, and a degraded operational tempo. This was precisely what the Japanese did not need at this time. Consequently, whatever Nagumo decided to do needed to be crafted from operational building blocks that were known commodities to the ship's crews. Finally, it must be recognized that even if there was a right solution for the situation Nagumo found himself in, odds were that it would not be easy to implement, risk-free, or even likely to forestall all of the horror and misery destined to descend on the Japanese this day. At this point in the battle, with the basic logic of the operational plan revealed as nonsense, the scouting plan in a shambles, and an unforeseen enemy suddenly on their flank, there was no magic solution that was going to transform the battle's outcome. Errors in strategy as grievous as the Japanese had inflicted on themselves are rarely reversible. Instead, the best that could really be hoped for was finding an approach whereby Kid Butai had a reasonable chance of coming away with some of its carriers intact, or at least having extracted a heavy toll from the Americans. What then did Nagumo have to work with in the way of actionable information? The answer is not much. In fact, there were three worrisome aspects to Tone No. 4's sighting report. First, the enemy's position as given by Amari just didn't make any sense at all. If Tone No. 4 had indeed sighted American surface ships where he said he did, then he had encountered them well to the north of his appointed outbound search route. Indeed, the Americans appeared to be in the search sector of Chikuma's No. 5 search line, so why hadn't that plane spotted the Americans first? Either Amari was out of place, or the enemy force wasn't where he had reported it to be. In fact, Amari's initial report placed the Americans some 60 miles north-northeast of their actual location. Indications are that Nagumo knew that scout aircraft sometimes took great liberties when working a contact and therefore doubted some aspects of Amari's report. Yet he had little choice but to take it at face value in terms of the reported location of the Americans. Second, Tone No. 4's report was miserably bereft of any indication as to what sort of American warships were out there. 10 enemy surface units. Just what did that mean? Within minutes of the message's receipt, Nagumo sent a signal back to Tone No. 4 to ascertain the American ship types. Yet despite the absence of positive confirmation that a carrier was with the enemy force, the presence of 10 warships of any kind should have been highly suspicious. The American task force, if it could attack with aircraft, was ideally located to ambush Nagumo's carriers. Indeed, as one historian of the battle has noted, there was no point in any enemy task force being where Amari said it was, unless it could attack with aircraft. Third, upon closer examination, the fact that the enemy was steering a course of 150 degrees was ominous in itself. The prevailing winds of the morning had been from out of the southeast, although they were presently shifting around to the northeast in the area near Kid Butai. Such a course track could well be indicative of an enemy task force launching aircraft. It would seem that the significance of some or all of these clues was not lost on Nagumo and his staff. Kusaka was apparently of the opinion that there couldn't be an enemy force without carriers in the area reported. If Senshi-S Sho is any indication, this appears to have been Nagumo's belief as well. However, and this is a critical point, both the Admiral and his staff came to the conclusion that whatever enemy force was out there was most probably a surface force. The Americans may have had at least one carrier in attendance with that force, but it was not viewed as a carrier force per se. Despite these ambiguities, there were several pieces of information that could be used to craft an operational plan. First, it was now clear that the Americans had a naval force in the area, and prudence would dictate that it be treated as if it contained a carrier until proven otherwise. Second, given that Nagumo's approximate location had been known to the enemy for almost 2 hours, he had to assume that any enemy carrier in the neighborhood would be in receipt of sighting reports. That meant that they could have launched against him by now. Consequently, Nagumo had every reason to expect further attacks, this time by carrier aircraft, which could arrive at any time. Third, Kid Butai's own geographic position was far from optimal. It was essentially located on the horns of a dilemma. There was no question that the horn to the northeast, the enemy naval force, was potentially the more dangerous of the two, and would have to be attacked as soon as was practical. However, as part of his reaction to this new problem, Nagumo needed to consider maneuvering his force in such a fashion as to minimize the impact of potentially being caught between two enemies. Nagumo basically had two options: to try and mount an immediate attack against the newly detected American force before Tomonaga returned, or to stand pat and attack after Tomonaga had been recovered. Obviously, all things being equal, attacking sooner rather than later would generally have been preferred. However, there were numerous problems with such a course of action. First of all, Nagumo was rightly cautious about launching a strike against the enemy force before conclusive ship identifications had been provided to him. He knew, and everyone on Akagi's bridge knew, what had happened to Rear Admiral Takagi when he had been placed in a similar situation just a month earlier. During the preliminaries at Coral Sea, the commander of Cardiff 5 had launched a powerful group of his aircraft against an American naval target based on what had turned out to be faulty spotting information. As a result, instead of attacking a carrier, the Japanese had wasted their strength sinking an American oiler and destroyer. The second obstacle, of course, was that Nagumo had nothing in the way of strike aircraft ready to go at 0745. No aircraft were currently spotted on his flight decks. The spate of cap fighter landings on all four carriers from ZO 730 to ZO 740 is proof positive of that. For fighters to have landed at that time, the decks absolutely had to be clear astern. Thus, striking immediately could not happen in less than the time it actually took to spot, warm up, and launch a strike. This meant a minimum of 45 minutes from now, that is, at about 8:30 at the earliest. However, Tomonaga's returning force was expected to begin orbiting Nagumo's carriers around 0815, meaning that an immediate strike would need to be launched in time for the morning strike force to land. Tomonaga's group undoubtedly contained damaged aircraft and wounded airmen. They would have been airborne for almost 4 hours by that time, and would soon be running low on fuel, particularly on those aircraft that had suffered battle damage to their wings. It would be imperative to get them down as quickly as possible, and the carrier Hi-K-Ch would have been keenly aware of this need. As we will shortly see, landing the Midway force, including not only the time to recover aircraft, but also the time needed afterward to clear them off of the flight deck and stow them below, was a process that could not help but take about 20 minutes per carrier. In the event, it was actually to take from around 8:37 to 9:12 to completely land Tomonaga and his men on all four carriers. The clever reader will immediately have noticed that since Tomonaga's force was not to be recovered until 0912 in any case, could not Nagumo have anticipated this and intentionally kept Tomonaga orbiting long enough to launch a full-blown strike with all his aircraft? Working backward from a hypothetical final recovery time for Tomonaga of around 0915 proves an illuminating exercise. If all of Tomonaga's aircraft were to be recovered by then they would need to start recovering by about 0845, or perhaps a bit later. This meant in turn that the reserve strike force would have to be launched and the decks clear by this time. Again, working backward, that implies an initial spotting time of about 0800 at the latest for the reserve strike force, meaning that rearming would need to be complete by then as well. In other words, if Nagumo was to launch anything before Tomonaga had to come down, he had to begin his spotting almost immediately. Time was, indeed, a very precious commodity. By 0745, one CH-TIE of Type 97s on Kaga and Akagi had already been rearmed with 800 Kigel bombs. Had Nagumo immediately given the order to stop rearming with bombs at 0745, as it appears he did, he might possibly have caught the armourers in time to prevent them from beginning the switch out of the second CH-TIE's torpedoes. This would have allowed Cardiff 1 to each begin spotting 2 of their 3 CH-TIE of torpedo-armed aircraft by about 0800. But in no case would Nagumo have been able to send up his entire reserve force of Type 97s before Tomonaga had to land. The CH-TIE on each carrier that had already been rearmed with Type 80 bombs simply couldn't be switched back in time. In terms of force, then, the difference between spotting now or waiting for the Kank squadrons to be completely rearmed essentially boiled down to about 15 aircraft. If Nagumo waited, his available forces would be as follows: Akagi, 18 Kank, 3 6-plane CH-TIE. Kaga, 26 or 27 Kank, 3 9-plane CH-TIE. Hairi, 18 Kanbaku, both of her 9-plane CH-TIE. SRI, 16 Kanbaku, both of her 9-plane CH-TIE. Total, 78 or 79 attack aircraft. Conversely, if Nagumo decided to spot immediately, the strike assets we can be reasonably sure were available were Akagi, 12 Kank, 2 of her total of 3 6-plane CH-TIE. Kaga, 18 Kank, 2 of her total of 3 9-plane CH-TIE. Hairi, 18 Kanbaku, both of her 9-plane CH-TIE. SRI, 16 Kanbaku, both of her 9-plane CH-TIE. Total, 64 attack aircraft. Clearly, even without the full torpedo plane complements from Akagi and Kaga, Nagumo had the potential to launch a powerful, well-balanced strike package. The 64 attack aircraft he had available immediately were easily capable of sinking 2 American carriers outright if properly employed. In fact, this group of aircraft represented more than twice the aggregate firepower that the Japanese would actually manage to throw at the American carriers during the day's later actions. However, such a strike would have broken the organisational symmetry of Cardiff 1's Kank groups by leaving a CH-TIE apiece of semi-armed planes sitting in both Akagi and Kaga's hangars, a move that no doctrinaire Japanese commander would have viewed with a favourable eye. A second alternative, and one which better preserved the fleet's organisational integrity, was to go with a more limited immediate strike and just send out Cardiff 2's 34 Kanbaku. This would have left Nagumo with another strike force in the process of arming, Cardiff 1's Kank, that could be launched shortly thereafter, and with Tomonaga's group to follow up later in the morning after they were recovered. The downside of this approach, though, was twofold. First, it reduced the power of the initial strike by reducing the sheer number of aircraft attacking. Second, it lowered the theoretical effectiveness of the strike by presenting the enemy with a one-dimensional threat, that is, no torpedo aircraft coming in at low altitude to stretch the enemy cap while the dive bombers attacked. Doctrine frowned on both of these sacrifices. Most likely, these were the only 2 options Nagumo and his staff considered in terms of launching an immediate attack. From the standpoint of post-war carrier operations, though, there were probably several more possibilities available to Kid Butai. If the enemy's southeast course heading was indicative of their conducting flight operations, then Kid Butai needed to consider its defensive needs as well. In light of this requirement and the technical and doctrinal imperatives at work, an approach that suggests itself is one wherein Cardivs 1 and 2 operated independently. Fuchida suggested something similar in the post-mortem analysis of his account, where he advocated attacking with only a single carrier division at a time while holding the other in reserve. However, it is clear that in making this suggestion, Fuchida, like Nagumo and his staff, was strictly thinking in terms of how best to deliver attacks against the enemy. The fleet's defence didn't figure into Fuchida's calculus, nor, apparently, that of any Japanese officer this day. Admiral Yamaguchi, too, was opposed to operating independently for the moment, although, as we shall see as the day wore on, his Cardiff II operated in an increasingly detached manner from Cardiff I. A slightly different approach might have been to effect an actual split along functional lines, with one carrier division attending to the fleet's offensive chores, the other to the defensive. This is precisely what modern carrier divisions often do. This same concept, in fact, had already been cooked up by the Yokosuka Squadron, but had yet to be formally implemented in the Navy's doctrine. If such were attempted, the logical division of labour would have had Cardiff II launching an immediate attack against the Americans, while Cardiff I was tasked with air defence. This would have conferred a number of advantages on the Japanese. From an offensive standpoint, using only Cardiff II's dive bombers for an initial attack obviously meant that the force would not benefit from combined arms. Nevertheless, it placed the attack force in very capable hands. It was commonly acknowledged that Cardiff II's strike units were the best of the best. With the famed Commander Egusa leading the counter-strike, the Japanese could be confident of scoring against the enemy. This approach also obviated the need to shut down all of Kid Butai's flight decks simultaneously upon Tomonaga's arrival. Akagi and Kaga's strike planes could have been recovered almost immediately, thereby keeping only Hyries and S-Rai's morning strike planes circling, while Egusa's force was spotted and launched. An even more esoteric approach might have attempted roughly the same functionalized arrangement of offensive-defensive duties, but with S-Rai and Akagi designated as the cap carriers, and Hyrie and Kaga the attack carriers. In this way, a total of 36 strike aircraft, 18 Kanbaku and 18 Kank, could be spotted immediately. In other words, this arrangement would not only split Kid Butai into two roles, but also would split the divisional structure in allocating those roles. The benefit of such an approach would be in allowing Kid Butai to launch an immediate strike package that also benefited from combined arms. However, it is clear that Nagumo and his staff were hamstrung by Japanese naval doctrine in terms of considering such options. In fact, it is unlikely that either of the functionalized approaches outlined above would have even occurred to them, particularly since the fruits of Yokosuka's research had yet to be harvested. In 1942, Japanese doctrine was strictly offensive, and its prescription for practically any tactical situation was to attack the enemy with a full-strength combined arms strike period. Nagumo's needs for a more flexible approach were therefore negated by the Imperial Navy's doctrinal emphasis on mass. In the end, as he saw it, he had only one option to attack with everything he had, regardless of how long it took to make the necessary arrangements. Regardless of the composition of the strike force, another question that needed solving was the matter of providing a fighter escort for the attack. Fuchida later asserted that providing Zeros in the 0800 timeframe would have proven impossible, as the second-wave fighters had already been sent aloft to reinforce the cap. This meant that Cardiff II's Kanbaku would have to go in unescorted, a prospect that no one relished. This factor has been cited by many post-war scholars as being a determining factor in Nagumo's decision. A detailed examination of Kid Butai's flight records, though, reveals an entirely different situation. As mentioned, the four-carrier Hick-Keich had anticipated Tomonaga's return, and apparently tried to proactively manage the impending shutdown of the flight decks by ratcheting down the cap from about 0730. As a result, by about 0800, Kid Butai had the following fighters available in the hangars: Akagi, 12, Kaga, 18, Hyrie, 8, S-Ri, 9, for a total of 47. 35 of these Zeros had been on board their respective ships for at least half an hour, and could thus be reasonably assured of being fueled and munitioned. This was a powerful escort force, especially given the demonstrable superiority of Japanese fighter aircraft and pilots over their American counterparts. However, committing this body of fighters en masse to a strike against the Americans meant that Kid Butai would have almost no fighter reserve to reinforce the cap, which by now was down to just 9 fighters. If Nagumo chose to launch with both Cardiff I and II, this rather pitiful cap would have to stay aloft for the duration of the spotting and launch process. Thereafter, they would need to be replenished and reinforced. Clearly, the number of fighters that would escort this second strike of the morning would have to be fewer than the 36 sent out with Tomonaga. However, it is equally clear that Nagumo could have provided his force with at least some escort. Indeed, an escort of a dozen Zeros could have easily been sent, and twice that many would probably not have been out of reach. The final factor Nagumo had to consider was how to maneuver his force. Kid Butai currently found itself between two enemies. Worse, Nagumo only really knew the location of one of these foes, Midway itself. Until Tone No. 4's position report was independently confirmed, he was dealing in vagaries as far as the American fleet was concerned. Knowing that he wanted to attack the American carrier, it made good sense to move away from Midway for the time being. Indeed, it may have even made sense to temporarily move away from the American naval force as well. In retrospect, Nagumo's subsequent decision to change course to the northeast and close the American force without first having sound knowledge of its composition and exact whereabouts was ill-conceived. It not only increased his danger from the American carriers, but it also had the effect of leaving Midway near to hand upon his southern flank. Nagumo was certainly well within his rights to maneuver freely. Frankly, by 0800 it should have been clear to everyone on Akagi's bridge that Yamamoto's battle plan needed to be summarily consigned to the ash can. Absolutely nothing was going according to plan this morning. Yet Nagumo still possessed some important advantages. For one thing, Japanese attack aircraft were somewhat longer ranged than their American counterparts. Taking a northwest course would have fulfilled his need to strike while employing his longer reach. He knew that the weather to his north wasn't good. If he could get back underneath the cold front he had come through on the previous day, he could use it to shield his movements. From there, it might have been possible to work around the Americans' northern flank. Nagumo might have suspected that the Americans were covering this quadrant with their own search aircraft, as indeed they were, but at least from that direction he could deliver attacks against them without fear of direct interference from Midway, which would be far to the south of where Nagumo would have hoped to develop the follow-on battle. Furthermore, he also could have used the time he spent manoeuvring northward to call for reinforcements in the form of Kakuta's second mobile force and start bringing them down from the Aleutians. Students of the battle will note that withdrawing to the north or northwest in the 0800-0900 time frame most likely would not have resulted in Kid Butai being missed altogether by the incoming American strike aircraft. Enterprise's dive bomber group eventually overhauled Kid Butai from the southwest and might also have detected a force lying directly to their north. Likewise, Kid Butai might have encountered Hornet's strike force as well. Thus, any maneuver Nagumo attempted in that direction would probably have exposed the fleet to a strike of some sort. However, this would potentially have had its benefits. Instead of facing attack groups from both Yorktown and Enterprise coming in simultaneously from several points on the compass, Kid Butai might have encountered these strikes sequentially and from a single direction, thereby making detection and interception much easier. The Japanese cap had already demonstrated that it could deal with a single vector threat if it was given sufficient warning. However, maneuvering in this fashion would cause problems, in that it necessarily meant throwing the entire operations timetable completely off kilter. This would undoubtedly have drawn fire from Yamamoto. Even if he were inclined to do so, Nagumo would have needed to begin coordinating not only the activities of his own vessels, but also helping reorient the various invasion and support forces as well. There was, in other words, a formidable level of plan inertia that would need to be overcome at an operational level. It wouldn't have been enough for Nagumo to simply radio Admiral Tanaka and say, "Stay where you are, and I'll let you know when it's safe to invade." Any hint of discarding the Commander-in-Chief's precious timetable would need to be backed up by mental toughness, sound logic, and the ability to supply combined fleet staff with reasonable estimates of when the job would be completed. Taking all together, and admittedly operating with the benefit of hindsight, the right answer to Nagumo's conundrum probably should have emphasized maneuver, offensive speed in preference to mass, and passive damage control. With 15 minutes in which to act, he didn't really have time to implement anything terribly fancy. But he could have helped himself immensely by immediately spotting every strike airplane in his hangars, whether they were armed or not, and launching them at the Americans. The 64 armed aircraft he had in hand were perfectly capable of doing enormous damage to his enemy, and by emptying his hangars, he removed the single greatest danger to his carriers, the presence of fueled and armed aircraft within them. However, even as Nagumo was considering these options, a new hurdle emerged. At 0753, Kirishima was seen to lay down smoke. Another American air raid was coming in. As we shall see, within a matter of just a few minutes, Nagumo would be under assault yet again. Launching an attack before Tomonaga returned was now going to be doubly difficult, in that he would need to spot aircraft in the face of an ongoing American attack. No right-minded HEK was going to be happy spotting aircraft while the force was being bombed. With the ships engaged in high-speed manoeuvring, pushing aircraft across an exposed flight deck and into their spots would have been hideously dangerous. Plane handlers could be maimed or crushed by an aircraft that got out of control, a very real possibility if the flight deck suddenly canted to one side. In fact, one of Zuikaku's plane handlers had been killed under similar circumstances at Coral Sea, and a plane lost overboard as a result. Furthermore, having the armed and fueled aircraft on deck directly exposed them to strafing attacks. Pressing home a spot and then launching under such circumstances would require both steady nerves and a steely resolve. Yet a truly insightful commander would have pointed out to his balking captains and HEK that keeping armed and fueled aircraft inside the ship during an American attack was, if anything, more dangerous than getting them airborne as quickly as possible, even in the face of enemy fire. The bottom line is that Nagumo chose not to attempt an attack at this time, most likely for a host of reasons. In the first place, he probably judged that trying to shoehorn an immediate strike in before Tomonaga landed was probably going to be too difficult to deal with, particularly with a new American attack rolling in. He might also have been concerned, too, that Tone No. 4's position report appeared to be bogus, meaning that further scouting work would be necessary to locate the enemy. Furthermore, while we know in hindsight that the fighter situation was not as dire as Fuchida later made it out to be, both Genda and Kusaka were apparently worried about finding enough escorts for the attack force at this time. They may not have known how far along the rearming activities had progressed within Akagi's hangars, nor what the status was of the fighters aboard the other ships in Kidbutai. And while it is not documented in the available sources, it is likely that both Genda and Kusaka disliked the idea of distorting the symmetry of Kidbutai's air groups by sending out a partial strike unit. Breaking the attack squadrons apart at this time meant trying to figure out where to integrate the remainder into strikes later in the day, if indeed the physical constraints of the force's flight decks would allow the leftovers to be spotted with Tomonaga's force later on. A partial strike now portended more mess and less efficiency later. It must be emphasized, too, that Nagumo's course of action was doctrinally correct. It favored mass and held out the promise of a fully integrated strike. Right now, the choices available to Nagumo were all tough calls between various half-measures, but by waiting a bit, he might not have to make the tough choices and would be able to strike with his full force. Many critics of his performance, Japanese and American alike, have neglected to acknowledge that he at least acted in a fashion that was doctrinally coherent. Indeed, if Nagumo had actually been fortunate enough to attack with Kidbutai's complete reserve strike force, it would have unquestionably been the most powerful, best coordinated strike launched by either side during the day. Unlike their American counterparts, Japanese torpedo aircraft were fully capable of delivering telling attacks. Furthermore, the Japanese were well versed in coordinating simultaneous dive bomber and torpedo strikes against moving targets. Any American flat top on the receiving end of such an assault would have found itself in the most dreadful peril. Indeed, a full strike by all four of Nagumo's flight decks had the firepower to sink every American carrier in the battle. However, had they been caught operating is that Nagumo probably felt little real urgency to strike at this moment. Hitting the American task force was clearly the highest priority mission at hand. Having only sighted 10 warships, though, he apparently judged the enemy to be rather weak. Indeed, it was possible, albeit unlikely, that a stray American carrier had simply been in the area, delivering aircraft or some such, and had moved toward Midway as a result of the actions on 3rd of June. No matter where it came from, there were no real indications at the moment that Kid Butai would have any problem attacking it in due time. Given the very real difficulties inherent in trying to put together a strike force before Tomonaga's imminent homecoming, the path of least resistance was simply to accept the slight delay in counter-attacking. Nagumo would use the time gained during recovery operations to complete the rearming of Cardiff 1's Kank, and then launch a full-blown strike force later in the morning. This perception of American weakness clearly influenced his subsequent decision to close the enemy. Indeed, before the strength of American air power made itself calamitously known, Nagumo would issue orders to his fleet at 9:30 that his intention was to destroy the enemy in a daylight engagement, in other words, a surface action. Apparently, Nagumo judged the American fleet to be weak enough that if need be, he could dispatch it with his own rather light screening forces, albeit stiffened by 2 fast battleships. Such an order would telegraph the unconscious message to the Japanese forces that there was no need to wait until after dark to employ the Imperial Navy's vaunted night battle techniques against this particular enemy. They could be mopped up right now, in broad daylight. Thus, for the next 3 hours, Nagumo treated this force as an enemy that was first to be attacked from the air and then annihilated by his destroyers and battleships on the surface. Much like his earlier decision to authorize attacking Midway with his reserve aircraft, Nagumo's decision to delay attacking the American task force has been mercilessly criticized. Fuchida remarked, "Looking back on this critical moment, which ultimately was to decide the battle, I can easily realize what a difficult choice faced the force commander. Yet, even now, I find it hard to justify the decision he took. Should he not have sacrificed every other consideration in favor of sending the dive bombers immediately against the enemy ships? Should he not have dispatched the torpedo bombers also, even though armed with bombs? He could have launched them to orbit until enough fighters could be recovered, refueled, and launched again to provide escort. The planes back from Midway could have been kept in the air at least until the bombers had cleared. Damaged planes, if unable to remain aloft any longer, could have crash-landed in the sea, where destroyers would have rescued the crews. Wise after the event, the saying goes. Still, there is no question that it would have been wiser to launch our dive bombers immediately, even without fighter protection. In such all-or-nothing carrier warfare, no other choice was admissible. Even the risk of sending unprotected level bombers should have been accepted as necessary in this emergency. Their fate would probably have been the same as that of the unescorted American planes which had attacked us a short while before, but just possibly they might have saved us from the catastrophe we were about to suffer. Fuchida's comments require careful analysis because they contain important grains of truth, but also some stunning misstatements. Fuchida was correct to say that if at all possible it was desirable to attack the Americans quickly. This was clearly a time when the book needed to be tossed aside in favor of haste. He was also right in pointing out that the fewer planes in the hangars, the better. Whether Fuchida truly apprehended this during the battle, or only upon reflection afterward, the truth remains that the best thing that Nagumo could have done to augment his force's survivability was to get as many aircraft out of his hangars and up in the air as possible, whether they had anything useful to do up there or not. Fuchida was wrong, however, on 3 crucial points. First, of course, was his deliberate neglect to mention that Nagumo could actually launch nothing at 0745, because all of the force's reserve strike aircraft were in the hangars. Second, whatever the need for a speedy attack, that imperative absolutely had to be balanced against the need to preserve the combat power of the force as a whole. In other words, Nagumo needed to minimize unnecessary losses, through deliberate ditchings and so on, among Tomonaga's force, if at all possible. Kid Butai was now confronted by not one, but 2 enemies. Without aircraft, Nagumo's carriers could neither attack nor defend themselves. Responding to a suddenly augmented estimate of enemy firepower with a knee-jerk reaction that deliberately subtracted from one's own inventory of this vital commodity hardly made good sense. In a war that was to be filled with examples of needless sacrifices of Japanese forces, Nagumo is to be applauded for electing to preserve Tomonaga's assets at this juncture rather than simply squandering them. Instead, he has been unfairly pilloried for his prudence. However, the most important criticism of Fuchida's comments stems from his ignoring a vital piece of information that his post-war account should have had ready to hand. What Fuchida almost certainly knew in 1951, but Nagumo could only suspect on 4th of June 1942, was that even as the commander of Kid Butai was mulling his options on the bridge of Akagi, the bulk of the American carrier aircraft that would ultimately destroy his force were either already taking to the air or were shortly to do so. In a nutshell, whether or not Nagumo launched a counterstrike before Tomonaga returned, he was still likely to be on the receiving end of a very heavy American attack at some point in the morning. It will be recalled that Admiral Fletcher had ordered Spruance to attack the Japanese as soon as practicable, and Spruance had duly headed southwest to close on Kid Butai's reported position. He had set 0700 as the time to launch both Hornets and Enterprise's air groups, and precisely at the appointed hour they had begun doing so. However, their subsequent flight operations were notable for a lack of coordination and poor organization. No plan was in place to use the two carriers' air groups en masse. Rather, American doctrine dictated that each carrier's group was an independent entity. Furthermore, Spruance's air advisor, Sir Dr. Miles R. Browning, neglected to issue detailed instructions to Hornet, thus leaving it to her skipper, Captain Mark A. Mitcher, to issue orders to his air group as to their outbound route. Furthermore, the method by which the two American carriers spotted their respective strike forces was left strictly up to their captains as well. Both skippers understandably wished to strike with every attack plane at their disposal. However, given the number of aircraft they would send up, they would need to first launch one portion of the strike, respot the decks, and then launch the remainder. During the respotting process, the aircraft already aloft would need to circle overhead, waiting for the complete strike to come up. Captain George D. Murray, Enterprise's skipper, chose to send up cap fighters and his longer-ranged SBDs in his first spot, followed by his shorter-ranged fighters and TBDs in the second package. This plan made a good deal of sense, in that it kept the shorter-ranged aircraft on deck until last, thus providing them with the best possible amount of actual flying time toward the objective. In the event, though, because of mechanical issues and other problems, Enterprise took an immensely long time to spot her second deck load after the first was launched. Furthermore, in the middle of the protracted spot, TF-16 had become aware of Tone Number 4's presence, in the form of its intercepted 0740 transmission to Nagumo, which to Enterprise's radio intelligence officer looked conspicuously like a sighting report. Desperate to get things moving, Spruance informed Enterprise's dive bombers to proceed on their assigned mission without waiting for the follow-up fighter escort or TBDs. Worse yet, when these second-wave aircraft were finally launched, they chose a different outbound route from the dive bombers. Thus, Enterprise's strike had already been split into two components, each of which was proceeding independently. Hornet's performance was even worse. Captain Mitcher, despite his experience, inexplicably decided to position his fighters in the front half of his first spot, followed by the SBDs and then half of the TBDs. Once these aircraft were aloft, the remainder of the torpedo planes would be spotted and launched. 45 minutes later, this is exactly what had transpired, leaving the fighters with just that much less combat radius. Hornet's strike departed at 7:55. The subsequent movements of Hornet's air group remain somewhat mysterious to this day. Some accounts maintain that the air group commander, Lieutenant C. Dr. Stanhope C. Ring, flew a southwest course after being launched and thereby ultimately missed Kid Butai by flying to the south of it. However, we hew to the interpretation that Hornet's group actually flew almost due west from their launch point, and thereby flew to the north of Nagumo. Why Ring made the decision to take his group west, rather than southwest toward the location of the initial PBY spotting reports, remains unclear. But the result was that only a single squadron of Hornet's air group would ultimately get into the fight this morning, and then only as the result of the most bizarre circumstances. The contrast between these rather benighted deck operations and those of the Japanese could not be more striking. Whereas Tomonaga's 108 aircraft had taken just 7 minutes to send aloft, Hornet and Enterprise laboured for an hour to launch their own strikes, which totalled only 8 aircraft, more 20 fighters, 68 dive bombers, and 29 torpedo aircraft, for a total of 117. Not only that, but instead of getting a coordinated strike from their 2 carriers, they had gotten 3 separate air groups heading in 3 different directions. As events transpired, some of the aircraft that set off together would not stay together long, leading to a further dispersion of power. Thus, the American aircraft, even if they reached the Japanese fleet at all, would be forced to attack in squadron-sized parcels. Nevertheless, by around 0800, the fates of Nagumo and Kid Butai were already sealed to a certain degree. The Americans had a fairly good idea of where the Japanese lay, and they had managed to put enough firepower in the air to be reasonably assured of causing the Japanese force great harm if they could find Kid Butai. This fact places the questions surrounding Nagumo's options in a completely different light. Whether Kid Butai struck back before or immediately after Tomonaga came home to roost, the Americans had still taken the initiative away from the Japanese. If Nagumo was to have attacked the Americans in time to forestall their strikes against him, he needed information from Tone No. 4 or somebody else much earlier in the morning. In fact, working backward from when the American carriers launched their respective strikes, it is possible to determine when spotting information ceased to be actionable in a preemptive sense. The slowest Japanese strike aircraft, the Type 97 Kank, cruised at 138 knots. They would take about an hour and a half to cover the roughly 200 miles to the American task force. But in the best of circumstances, attacking even the Yorktown, which, as we shall see, would start sending her own planes aloft at 0838, meant that Nagumo would have had to have his own aircraft in the air by around 0715 in order to hit the Americans first. That, in turn, means that Nagumo needed to have begun spotting his strike no later than 6:30. Worse yet, hitting Enterprise and Hornet before they began launching would have required having a strike in the air no later than 0530. Thus, by the 0745-0800 time period, when Nagumo was actually debating the information he had in his hands, the Americans could no longer be forestalled. Nothing Nagumo could do at this point could entirely unmake the morning's events. This, in turn, shifts a hefty share of the day's blame away from Tone No. 4 and onto Chikuma's No. 1 aircraft, which had flown the No. 5 search line. As bad as Petty Officer Amari's subsequent navigation would prove, the critical reconnaissance failure really lay here. Chikuma No. 1 was the only plane that could have gotten timely information into Nagumo's hands. Had this plane flown its route correctly and closer to the surface, it almost certainly should have detected the American task force between 6:50 and 6:30, that is, within the time frame, barely, needed to act decisively. Its failure cost Nagumo more than an hour of reaction time. It was this failure, not Tone No. 4's late launch, that set in motion a veritable avalanche of negative tactical consequences. Chikuma No. 1's gaffe was indicative of a larger failure, however, for it was here that the paltry number of aircraft devoted to the morning's search really hurt Nagumo's chances. No properly conceived search program should have been completely compromised by the failure of a single asset. There should have been more aircraft devoted to the search. Some would point to Chikuma No. 1's inability to sight the Americans as somehow supporting the notion that the weather was so bad on Nagumo's eastern flank that no number of additional scouting assets in the area would have rectified the situation. However, this makes no sense. The failure of one scout plane in one location, for whatever reasons of local weather conditions, poor navigation, and/or improper scouting technique, says nothing about the odds of another nearby plane in slightly different weather, with different sight lines, and performing its search in a disciplined manner to detect the same enemy. There can be no denying that more search assets would have significantly bettered Nagumo's odds. But Japanese doctrine and its offensive-minded outlook precluded this. As it was, Genda's reconnaissance scheme was essentially a roll of the dice, and Nagumo had crapped out hours ago. Kirishima's warning smoke at 0753 presaged the arrival of a series of nearly continuous enemy attacks over the next 40 minutes, delivered by 3 separate American formations. The first was a group of 16 dive bombers under Major Lofton R. Henderson that were approaching Kid Butai from the southeast. His Marine pilots, members of VMS B-241, had taken off just after Midway's B-26s and TBFs. However, owing to the slower cruising speed of his SBDs, as well as having taken a more northerly course, they had been later in spotting the Japanese force. Henderson's men were some of the rawest flyers on the American side of the battle. Most of them had never flown an SBD until a few days previously, and more than half had only been with the unit for a few days. In their commander's opinion, his unit did not yet have the skills needed to execute a true dive-bombing attack. Instead, Henderson led his flight in from an altitude of 9,500 feet, hoping to survive long enough to execute a shallower glide-bombing attack against the 2 flat tops he saw on the port side of the Japanese formation, the wildly manoeuvring carriers of Cardiv-2. Henderson's men had just started their gradual descent toward the target when the Zeros hit them. The Japanese Cap fighters tore into Henderson's formation with merciless precision. Akagi's Lieutenant Ibusuki and his 2 remaining 6th Coup pilots were joined by Hiryu's 3rd Patrol, a pair of Zeros led by W.O. Kodama Yoshimi, as well as Soryu's 3rd Patrol Shotai, under the redoubtable Lieutenant Fujita. This was in fact the entirety of the Japanese Cap, as Kaga's 4 remaining fighters were already lining up for recovery. 9 fighters wasn't much with which to tackle a full squadron of enemy dive bombers, but in the event they proved deadly effective. 6 U.S. aircraft went flaming down into the ocean almost at once. Major Henderson was one of the first, trying to hold his plane and his formation steady until the end. Henderson's death would lead to his name being used for a captured airfield on Guadalcanal, which would earn one of the most glorious names in American military history. However, there was nothing glorious about the predicament his surviving men found themselves in. They had little choice but to hold formation and continuing boring in toward the target, firing back as best they could. Somehow, in the process, the American radio gunners managed to send Hiryu's Kodama to his demise. Finally, Henderson's wingman, Captain Richard E. Fleming, led the shredded squadron into their glide-bombing attacks. Below them, Gunnery Lieutenant Nagayasu on Hiryu again ordered his batteries into action, adding to the general noise and confusion, and making the American attack runs all the more difficult. They were coming in from all sides now, their formation shattered. The 25 mm mounts that lined Hiryu's flight deck spat out strands of incongruously pretty tracer shells. To the Japanese watching from Akagi, it was obvious that the Americans were poorly trained. No self-respecting dive bomber pilot would have attempted to bag a carrier with such an anemic attack. Glide bombing was the worst of both worlds. It eschewed the slender advantage of hugging the deck, while accruing neither of the twin benefits gained from a high-angle attack accuracy and near invulnerability to return fire. Yet the results of the American attack were spectacular, if utterly ineffective. Despite the hell they had just come through, Fleming's men managed to bracket Hiryu with numerous near misses between 0808 and 0812, some as close as 50 meters from the ship. These bombs raised such waterspouts that Yamaguchi's flagship was momentarily hidden from the eyes of the rest of the fleet. Nagayasu and his men in the gun tubs were drenched with seawater. Yet in the end, Hiryu emerged unscathed from the grey-white plumes that had erupted around her. Once again, the Americans had paid prohibitively for no result, and the Japanese Combat Air Patrol thereupon hounded the surviving SBDs out of the area. One portion of this rather sorry episode has been overlooked, namely that even against poorly trained American pilots attacking in a highly vulnerable fashion, Hiryu's anti-aircraft failed to account for a single enemy aircraft that we know of, despite Nagayasu's own belief that his very fierce fire had been responsible for the Americans' poor aim. Hiryu should have been able to bring a half-dozen 5-inch and a dozen or so 25mm barrels to bear on almost any broadside bearing. This was hardly an insignificant amount of firepower, yet she apparently hit nothing. Indeed, American strafing killed more of her crewmen than she claimed in return. If this was how Japanese AA performed against opponents who were hardly the varsity, it did not bode well if the Americans' A-team should suddenly appear. Yet for all the Japanese knew, this was the enemy's best. They had seen 3 different American attacks thus far, the last of which had been flown by carrier-type aircraft, although the Japanese did not know that Henderson's squadron was land-based. Yet in each case, the performance of the Americans had been subpar. They were clearly brave, but they had come in dumb unescorted and attacking poorly. If these were the same caliber of pilots who had managed to send Shokaku limping back to the yard, then Cardiff 5's lowly status within Kid Butai was well deserved. However, almost simultaneously with Henderson's gallant but futile effort, another American attack began materializing. At 0754, Japanese lookouts spotted aircraft at high altitude, which quickly revealed themselves to be a dozen 4-engined American bombers. This was the B-17 force of Lieutenant Col Walter C. Sweeney, which had been sent aloft at 0430 to attack Tanaka's transports, only to be redirected north by Midway as soon as the Japanese carriers had been detected. They were very high up, over 20,000 feet. The Zeros were going to have a devil of a time reaching them all the way up there. Not only that, but the entirety of the cap was already engaged in repulsing Henderson's attack in any case. The bombers split into 3 groups and went after Akagi, Soryu and Hiryu in an almost leisurely fashion. The Japanese began banging away with their heavy AA guns, but the Americans were never in any great danger. Having attacked Tanaka's invasion force the previous day from medium altitudes, Sweeney's men, upon further reflection, had judged their approach rather too low. This morning, against more heavily armed warships complete with fighter cover, they had decided to stay higher up. It was a sound decision, as the Japanese anti-aircraft fire was none too good. The Americans noted that the Japanese shells seemed to be fused to detonate at the right altitude, but consistently exploded well behind them. Altitude, however, worked both ways. Down below, the Japanese captains watched as the bombers came into their runs. Coolly, they waited until each element had dropped, then put the helm over into radical evasive maneuvers. Whether the Americans dropped promptly or even on target was largely irrelevant. The pirouetting warships below still had a good 30 seconds worth of airtime to play with, meaning that they could be a quarter of a mile in nearly any direction when the bombs finally landed. Even by dropping a stick of a dozen or more 500 LB weapons at a time, the odds of securing a hit weren't good. Not only that, but the cloud cover over Kid Butai frustrated several of their attacks, forcing some aircraft to make numerous runs before finally dropping. Yet, the Americans almost got lucky. In the course of the 20-minute-long series of runs, both Hiryu and Soryu were bracketed by near misses, to the consternation of the Japanese. In the end, though, the American heavies scored no damage. In the midst of all this mayhem, at 0758, tone number 4 sent a message apprising Nagumo that the enemy task force had changed course to Iroetio. Nagumo sent a terse communiqué back, "Advise ship types." Course information was not what was required at this point. He needed the enemy force's composition as quickly as possible. It seems almost certain that Nagumo signalled to Soryu around this time to make her special reconnaissance aircraft ready for launch. This was a perfect mission for the new D4Y, where its great speed could hopefully make up for some of the force's lost time. Given that both Henderson's and the B-17 attacks were getting underway by 0800, the men of Akagi had been somewhat incredulous to observe Kaga holding her course into the wind long enough to bring on board the last of her 4 Cap fighters. Kid Butai was vulnerable, with only 9 fighters overhead. Not surprisingly, Akagi had already been warming up a replacement Shotai. Kaga, as soon as she had recovered her foursome, immediately spotted another 7 for warm-up and launch, even as the B-17s droned away overhead. In fact, intermittent Cap launches from all the carriers would punctuate the breaks in the action. Clearly, each carrier's captain was feeling the need to augment the Cap. Whether they were operating independently or under orders from the flagship, we cannot know. But the net effect was that the flight decks were in near constant use by small groups of aircraft at this time. Such was the spectacle that Tomonaga and his returning force beheld when Kid Butai heaved into view at about 0805. On the northern horizon ahead of them, their carriers bobbed and weaved beneath the American heavy bombers. Hiryu described a series of S-shaped maneuvers as sticks of bombs landed on either side. Soryu was resorting to the simple expedient of putting the helm hard over to starboard and carving an enormous donut in the ocean. Seeing the retreating American SBDs from Henderson's savaged flight coming toward them on the deck, one of Tomonaga's Akagi Zeros took this opportunity to join the Cap. He was joined by 6 of Kaga's Kanbaku as well. The Type 99 was a maneuverable airplane once it had shed its bomb, and some of Cardiff 1's drivers may have judged that they could take on their opposite numbers in the apparent absence of any American fighters. At the same time, seeing their mothership under heavy attack, all 9 of Soryu's strike fighters pitched into steep climbs to engage the B-17s overhead. For his part, Tomonaga and the rest of the Kank and Kanbaku simply eased down to 400 meters and circled at a distance, waiting to commence landing. Until the American attacks cleared up, the carriers below had no ability to take their aircraft on board. Waiting with them was W.O. Yoshino Haruo, the recon flight leader from Kaga. Yoshino, who had joined the Navy because all the marching in the army seemed like way too much work, took a while to find Kaga amidst the chaos. The fleet was all spread out as a result of the attack. When he did find her, Kaga's flight deck was already closed for business and not receiving aircraft. Instead, Yoshino loitered nearby with Kaga's Kanbaku. Akagi had turned into the wind briefly at 0808 to launch a flight of 3 fighters under W.O. Ono Zenji. Kaga followed suit at 0815, sending up a group of 5 Zeros under N's, Yamaguchi Hiroyuki. Given the threat of attack, the carriers weren't bothering holding a steady course into the wind for their launches. They were simply bringing their bows momentarily close enough to it that the Zeros could dash down the deck and into the air. Between these 2 launches and the fortuitous addition of the returning strike fighters, Kid Butai was now finally beginning to put sufficient air cover up to beat off the ongoing American attacks. However, the B-17s overhead proved to be tough customers. Kaga's Yamaguchi immediately took 2 of his wingmen up in pursuit of them, joining Soryu's Zeros. However, the attacks by both groups of fighters were desultory at best. They managed to damage a few of the flying forts, but none seriously. Lieutenant Colonel Sweeney's pithy summation afterward was that their heart was not in their work. This was probably simply confirmation of what everybody in the force below already knew. The Zero was no great shakes at high-altitude combat. Not only that, but after 4 hours in the air, Soryu's fighters were almost at the end of their tether in terms of fuel and ammunition. At 0811, just as Hiryu was being bracketed by Henderson's attack, Tony No. 4 signalled back to Nagumo that the enemy is composed of 5 cruisers and 5 destroyers. On Akagi's bridge, a momentary sense of relief washed over Nagumo's staff. Perhaps there was not as much to worry about as had previously been feared. If the Americans had only surface ships and no carriers, then they were well outside the range where Kid Butai needed to worry about them for the moment. The critical question of why the enemy would be where he was without having carriers was apparently not explicitly asked, although Kusaka remembered in retrospect that he was still suspicious. One message alone, in his opinion, couldn't make it clear that no enemy carriers were there, nor could there be an enemy force without carriers in the reported area under the prevailing circumstances. Sure enough, 10 minutes later, at about 08:20, a third message from tone number 4 came back to Akagi that permanently dispelled Nagumo's temporary sense of security. The enemy is accompanied by what appears to be a carrier. Nagumo's exact reaction has not been recorded, but there couldn't help but have been great consternation on Akagi's bridge. Now, beyond all doubt, the Admiral and his staff knew that their original battle plan was out the window. The American Navy was present in force. Destroying the enemy flight deck was absolutely the highest priority at hand. A justifiable question at this point would be why it took tone number 4 as long as it did to discern a carrier in the midst of the enemy formation. Indeed, one recent historian goes so far as to assert that the reason Amari didn't see the carrier initially is because it wasn't operating directly with its escorts. However, this position really isn't sustainable. First of all, this simply isn't how escorting vessels behave. More important, it is completely unsubstantiated by the American ship records. The most likely explanation continues to be a combination of variable visibility conditions and/or haphazard spotting on the part of Amari. At the moment, however, nothing could be done, as Tomonaga was still orbiting the fleet. On board Akagi, Hikch Masuda was dying to begin recovery operations. But the American B-17s continued loitering overhead, making it impossible. In addition, Akagi now had yet another group of fighters warming up on its deck, a quartet of Zeros under PO-1C Taniguchi Masao. Kaga, having sent aloft Yamaguchi's Shotai at 8-1-5, had another trio on deck getting ready as well. Its Shotaicho, PO-1C Yamamoto Akira, would be flying for the second time this morning. Hiryu was in the same boat and was at this very moment sending aloft a threesome under Latiomori Shigeru, who was taking his second shift aloft as well. Meanwhile, on Soryu, preparations to launch the D-4Y reconnaissance plane were well advanced, with the spanking new bomber warming up on the flight deck. At 08:24, in the midst of these cap preparations, several ships within the force sighted a submarine periscope smack in the middle of the formation. This was Nautilus, which had been skulking around at periscope depth on an intercept course from the southwest. She had previously spotted Kid Butai at 07:10, sighting the smoke of bombing and AA fire beyond the horizon to the northwest. Her skipper, Lieutenant Commander William Brockman, had promptly changed course to close the target and gone to battle stations. Brockman was rewarded at 7:55 when he sighted masts on the horizon. However, a sharp-eyed Cap Zero spotted him in return and made a quick strafing run. Brockman took his boat down to 100 feet and continued closing. As he did so, the sounds of Japanese sonar could be heard ahead. At 800, Nautilus's skipper was pleased to sight 4 vessels, one of which appeared to be a battleship of the Ise class, one a light cruiser of the Jintsu class, and the last 2 apparently cruisers of the Yubari class. All were headed westerly on course 250 at 25 knots. Naturally, Brockman decided to attack the battleship and changed his course to draw ahead of her. However, at this moment, his periscope was again spotted by an alert Japanese aircraft, most likely a Type 95 float plane aloft on anti-submarine patrol. This time, Brockman was greeted not with a strafing, but with a bomb deposited next to his boat. Worse yet, the enemy light cruiser bored in with at least 2 other escorts, pinging as they came. Despite the risks, though, Brockman boldly remained at periscope depth and continued to work closer to his quarry. Nautilus had, in fact, stumbled onto Kid Butai as it temporarily reversed course westward, bringing it directly toward the American submarine. The battleship he had sighted was most likely Kirishima, now leading the heavies westward after the formation's reversal. The Jintsu-class cruiser was obviously Nagara, while the two Yubari-class cruisers were actually Kagero-class destroyers, their larger forward stacks perhaps being the reason for Brockman's misidentifying them. Interestingly, Kirishima appears to have been well in advance of Nagumo's flat tops at this time, because Brockman did not sight any of them. Despite Brockman's boldness, the Japanese knew he was coming. At 0810, Nagara dropped 5 depth charges near the sub, just as Nautilus was getting set up for her final attack run. At 0817, 6 more depth charges came crashing down. Things were getting a bit too hairy for even the gutsy Brockman's tastes, and he eased his boat down to 90 feet to avoid the wary eyes of both the buzzing cap and the Japanese lookouts. Nagara and her consorts promptly dropped 9 more depth charges. Brockman, though, popped back up to periscope depth as soon as the attack ended. Raising his periscope, he recalled that the picture presented was one never experienced in peacetime practices. Ships were on all sides moving across the field at high speed and circling away to avoid the submarine's position. Ranges were above 3,000 yards. The Jintsu-class cruiser had passed over and was now astern. The battleship was on our port bow and firing her whole starboard broadside battery at the periscope. Brockman, though, was having problems setting up his attack. One of his torpedoes was running hot in its tube, having had its retaining pin sheared away during the depth charging. It was making a hellacious racket, and Brockman was certain that the Japanese escorts could hear its banshee wailing. Nagumo's fleet, what little Brockman could see of it, was still on a westerly heading when Nautilus fired at 0825. His target was Kirishima. Taking aim at her starboard side, Brockman let fly with 2 torpedoes at a range of 4,500 yards, or at least he thought he did. He found out later that 1 tube did not fire, leaving only 1 fish streaking toward the target. Kirishima evaded this threat by executing a sharp turn to port, heading south and directly away from the torpedo. Whether Kirishima even saw Nautilus is open to debate. Her firing at the sub's periscope may in fact have been directed at a fresh set of American planes that were attacking her about this time. Whatever the reason, though, her neat turn away was exactly what was needed to spoil Brockman's attack. Not only that, but Nagara once again sighted the sub and charged in to renew her attack. Brockman quickly dove to 150 feet, just as another round of depth charging began at 8:30. As soon as Nautilus's scope was seen on the western edge of the force, Nagumo's carriers made tracks to get away by heading back east. The fact that Nagara's persistent attacks had forced the American boat to dive again was comforting for the Japanese, at least as far as it went. However, the knowledge that an American submarine was lurking near at hand undoubtedly notched the pressure on the Japanese up still further. Not only that, but nearly simultaneous with Nautilus's appearance, yet another American air attack. The third in the last 30 minutes began materializing. This was a force of 11 old Marine SB-2U Vindicator scout bombers, the second half of VMSB 241, led by that unit's executive officer, Major Benjamin W. Norris. His aircraft had followed Henderson's flight in at some distance. Captain Aoki, seeing this new threat, at 0827 turned Akagi sharply away from the Americans. Fortunately for Akagi, she had just launched fighters, or she would have been sorely beset. As it was, though, these new additions, as well as some of the Zeros that had just beaten off Henderson, were able to assemble in time to deflect this new blow. Akagi's hard-working Lieutenant Ibusuki was present, along with the 2 6th Q pilots still in the air. They were joined by W.O. Ono Zenji's trio. Hiryu contributed the 2 remaining members from her third watch. And Soryu's Lieutenant Fujita and his 3-plane Shotai also charged back into the attack. Norris's command, though, benefited from the rather hasty nature of the defence thrown up in front of the force's 2 flagships. The Americans lost no inbound aircraft this time, though several were badly shot up. Whether by prudence or simply judging that Akagi and Hiryu were too far away to be attacked effectively, Norris decided to focus his efforts on the battleship Haruna. She was on the edge of the main body, and as such was easier to get to. In the face of the battleship's AA, they began tilting into their dives. Haruna's skipper, Rear Admiral Takuma Tamotsu, wasted no time in demonstrating that he knew how to drive his ship. The big battle wagons slithered through a series of evasive turns, neatly threading the needle between the Vindicator's attacks. Although Haruna was bracketed by 5 or 6 near misses, the bombs didn't damage her a whit. At the conclusion of the attack, Kid Butai's Zeros harried the Americans off to the southwest, eventually claiming a pair of dive bombers. The reader is forgiven for being confused by the rather bewildering welter of goings-on at this juncture, but that is precisely the point that needs to be made. The situation was confusing, no less to the contemporary historian trying to pick apart the exact sequence of events ex post facto than to the men standing on Akagi's bridge. The American air attacks, while materially ineffective, were nearly constant. As a result, Kid Butai was having no luck getting into any sort of a rhythm. It was operating reactively. Worse, its various responses, at least in terms of air defence, do not appear to have been centrally coordinated. The rather precipitous drop in cap assets at around 0800 had been followed by something of an overreaction on the part of the individual Hikokos as they stoked the cap back up. There does not appear to have been anyone within the force looking down the road and assessing what was really needed. Instead, as the American attacks rolled in, the Japanese responded almost reflexively, sending up shotais piecemeal. It's not hard to see how this might have happened. Naguma was stuck on board a wildly manoeuvring carrier, watching his other vessels running pell-mell in all directions. Every time it looked as if things were settling down a bit, another air raid warning would come in. Nagumo can hardly have known where all his ships were at any given time, let alone have had an appreciation of what his aggregate cap strength was. Here is where the Japanese lack of early warning radar materially damaged their chances in the battle. Radar was like a crystal ball in effect. It allowed the commander to look a certain distance into the future, see developing threats, and plan accordingly. As it was, though, the cap battle was being directed by 4 air officers on 4 separate ships who could barely communicate with each other or their forces aloft. Without the ability to prognosticate what was pending in the way of attacks, the predictably human response to the question of how much KP is enough was just a little bit more. Lack of radar also reduced the effective distance at which the cap fighters could engage the Americans. Early warning for the Japanese force was provided by its outlying cruisers and destroyers. Yet these pickets could only be pushed out so far from the force before they too would be beyond visual range of the carriers. As a result, the cap was frequently engaging the Americans fairly close to the Japanese carriers. In many cases, the Zeros pursued fleeing Americans through the midst of the force itself. Not only was this dangerous, but it also meant that in many cases the cap wasn't being given the space it needed to operate most efficiently. Many of the American attacks would have probably been even more badly chewed up had they been detected farther away. Having radar might not have been a panacea for the Japanese, though. As the Americans could testify, learning to use this new technology was no cakewalk. Effective use of radar had already driven the Americans to make the conceptual leap toward the centralized coordination of air defense assets from many ships via a single location, the Combat Information Center, CIC. The first prototype CIC had been installed aboard Hornet when she was commissioned in October 1941. Even later in the war, having had radar on their ships for 2 years, the Japanese would never manage to make this leap. Above all, effective use of radar required adequate communications to the individual cap elements. The Japanese, operating as they were on a single radio frequency for all of their aircraft, and having faulty radios in their Zeros, met neither of these prerequisites. Thus, even if the Japanese had had radar at Midway, its use might have been limited. By around 8:30, the American attacks were finally starting to wind down, and the Japanese were beginning to think about landing the Midway attack force. Admiral Yamaguchi, however, was probably concerned by having been on the receiving end of an attack by what had appeared to be carrier-type aircraft. Apparently exasperated by the inability to strike back, he had a message flashed from Hiryu to Akagi's plane guard destroyer Nawaki. She, in turn, dutifully relayed the admiral's message to Nagumo. Consider it advisable to launch attack force immediately. Nagumo's mood upon receiving this entreaty from his brash subordinate has not been recorded, but it hardly could have been charitable. By any rational standard, the time for launching a strike against the Americans was long past, and Yamaguchi should have known it. Indeed, the force was even now scrambling in preparation for bringing Tominaga down. More important, of course, was the fact that at 0820, Nagumo still had no ability to strike immediately. The photographs taken by American B-17s during this interval make it perfectly clear that no strike aircraft were on the Japanese flight decks. Thus, Yamaguchi's entreaty really was tantamount to suggesting that Tominaga's flight be ditched en masse, in preference for an immediate spotting and subsequent launch at perhaps 095. Coming from a man who had suggested during the planning for Pearl Harbor that the solution to Hiryu's and Soryu's shorter range was to abandon them off the Hawaiian Islands after the completion of the operation, this simply was not a serious proposal. Nagumo didn't even bother replying. At the same time Yamaguchi was venting spleen, Akagi sent aloft PO-1C Taniguchi's did the same with PO-1C Yamamoto's threesome. To the rear, Soryu sent up her Type 2 recon aircraft, with explicit orders to find the American task group and send back a definitive position fix. The D-4Y buzzed off to the east. None too soon, as at 0834, Petty Officer Amari radioed Nagumo that Tone No. 4 was homeward bound. This announcement was not greeted with joy on Akagi, and Amari was told in short order to stay where he was. Besides his admiral's displeasure, Amari was beginning to have difficulties of his own. His fuel was starting to run low. Worse, the Americans were now aware of his presence, having detected him on radar at around 0815. On several occasions during the morning, flitting about just above the southern horizon, he was hunted by enemy cap fighters. Amari's pilot, though, skillfully ducked into clouds when pressed. Relatively near at hand to Tone's elusive scout, Frank Jack Fletcher's Yorktown was about to get into the action. Having charged down from the northeast after recovering her search aircraft, she was now within range to launch. Fletcher had hoped that further reports from the PBYs would clarify the enemy situation somewhat during the interim. However, no new information on any additional Japanese carrier groups was forthcoming, and in the end Fletcher ordered Yorktown to begin launching at 0838. Unlike her sister ships, Yorktown managed to launch a well-coordinated strike. She sent up a total of 35 aircraft 6 fighters, 17 dive bombers, and 12 torpedo planes, in 2 deck loads. The SBDs went first, followed by the TBDs, the latter heading off immediately to the southwest at 2,500 feet. A quick spot and launch then sent up the shorter-ranged Wildcats. The SBDs and fighters soon followed after the slower TBDs. The entire formation was in the air by 0906. Yorktown's 2nd Dive Bomber Squadron, VS-5, was left on board as a reserve, much to the collective disgust of its pilots. Fletcher's plan was fairly simple. He and his staff had mapped out a course to an intercept point where they expected Nagumo's fleet would be at 0900. They knew they had to allow for the fact that the original Japanese sighting reports were now several hours old. Further, while they were convinced that Nagumo would roughly hold his course, they also assumed that he would not approach Midway too closely. Therefore, Fletcher judged the most likely position of the Japanese carriers to be 30 Sil-N, 179 Sil-W, which at 0900 would place them at a bearing of 240 degrees, 150 miles from TF-17. Yorktown's planes would fly a course straight to that point. If they did not spot the enemy, they would turn northwest and fly up the enemy's line of advance, before turning at last for the northeast leg back home. With such an approach, Fletcher's staff believed they would be able to come across the Japanese no matter which way they manoeuvred. It is worthwhile noting the differences between the staff and air operational work aboard TF-16 and 17. Whereas TF-16's launches had devolved into almost a shotgun approach to the problem, Yorktown's entire group was directed along a single bearing toward a single point on the ocean. This meant that if Yorktown's group found the enemy, it would be in a much better position to deliver a well-coordinated attack. Not only that, but since TF-17's departure was almost an hour later, her air group would benefit from changes in weather conditions and visibility as they flew their route. With Yorktown's launch, the Americans now had a total of 151 carrier aircraft in the air. The question was, could they find the Japanese? At the very moment Fletcher was sending the last of his aircraft up, Nagumo was bringing the bulk of his down. Finally, at 08:37, Akagi hoisted a white flag with a black ball, indicating that her decks were open for business. Underneath the landing ensign were two numeric flags giving the wind velocity in meters per second. Still circling overhead, Tomonaga's force no doubt breathed a collective sigh of relief to see these welcome signals come fluttering up the carrier's yardarms. Now came the tricky part. In the intervening 4 hours since Tomonaga's launch, Kid Butai had moved farther away from the descending cold front. As the force had travelled southeast, the wind direction had gradually shifted around until it was now coming out of the east-northeast at about 3 meters second. Contrary to most maps of the battle that show Kid Butai steering a southeastern course at this time, it is far more likely that the carriers were now all steering roughly east. This is supported by Akagi's log entries in the Nagumo report and is consistent with a carrier force landing aircraft. Furthermore, we know from the post-war testimony of several of Kid Butai's carrier officers that the carriers moved in unison when performing large takeoff or landing operations. Thus, we can presume that all 4 carriers were headed roughly east at this time. The other effect that the eastward turn had was to place Cardiff 2 Hiryu and Soryu in the lead of the formation. Whereas formerly the 2 divisional flagships had taken the fore, now the fleet had essentially turned on its heels, with each ship turning individually to take up the new heading. Nagumo didn't have time for niceties, now dressing his formation for parade would have to wait. It seems likely, though, that Soryu used her superior speed to catch up to Hiryu somewhat, keeping her divisional flagship off her starboard beam. Thus, Kid Butai's carriers were no longer in a box formation, but were gradually elongating into something of a trapezoid. The position of the escorting heavy units is more difficult to ascertain, and it is probable that they were in various sectors of the formation during different times of the day. However, it seems likely that Bat Div 3 was in column on the port side of the formation, with Haruna in the lead. Likewise, Abe's flagship, Tone, led Chikuma on the starboard side. Nagara was in the centre van, leading the carriers. The positions of many of the Japanese destroyers are almost totally unknown, other than the fact that the majority of them were acting as air raid pickets. The rough whereabouts of Arashi we know about only because she was busy dealing with Nautilus for a portion of the morning. We have consistent evidence that Nowaki was Akagi's plane guard destroyer, and Isokaze was Soryu's. We can presume that Hagikaze was likely acting in the same role for Kaga. But the specific location of the others is unknown, and in the absence of their logs will likely remain so. In truth, they probably varied wildly as the morning's attacks unfolded. Nagara, as squadron flagship for the destroyers, most likely tried to maintain a position at the head of the formation, but it would appear that she may have roamed about as well, particularly in response to Nautilus's earlier attack. Landing an airplane on a carrier is perhaps the most difficult challenge faced by any pilot, and Tomonaga's men had to do it under more stressful circumstances than normal. The morning mission had been a long one, and everyone was hungry and tired. Their aircraft were low on fuel, and the landing had to be conducted under the threat of enemy attack. They needed to get down as quickly and precisely as possible. Unfortunately, given the damaged condition of many of the airplanes, Just getting them on the deck in one piece was going to be a challenge. Indeed, Fuchida's rather glib statement that, with the veteran flyers we had at this time, speedy recovery operations on board the carriers even under stringent battle conditions were little more than child's play, is clearly an oversimplification of the situation facing Tomonaga's flyers. His quip both understates the inherent dangers of landing operations and simultaneously heaps further discredit on Nagumo's moanings regarding his pilot's training. In fact, both men were wrong. Nagumo's pilots were well trained, but carrier landings were a very delicate business, even for experienced aviators. The aircraft began forming clockwise holding patterns outboard of their home carriers. Each was readily identifiable by the configuration of their island and deck features, but each also had a large white kana symbol painted on the flight deck aft for identification, A for Akagi, Ka for Kaga, Hai for Hiryu, and Sa for Soryu. Planes with mechanical problems or wounded crewmen were moved to the heads of queue. One by one, each plane broke out of the holding circle, crossed the bow of the carrier some ways ahead, and flew down its opposite side. Once behind the ship, each turned inward to line up their final approaches. This took them practically over the top of the carrier's plane guard destroyer, which was stationed 700 to 1,000 meters astern. From there, they could rescue any downed aviators who fell short of the fantail or went over the side. If all was normal, the aircraft would turn in so as to be about 700 meters behind the carrier, at 200 meters altitude. Just as with takeoffs, the decision-making authority for landing was vested almost solely in the pilot. The Imperial Navy had no comparable officer to the U.S. Navy's Landing Signal Officer, LSO. No one on board the carrier was charged with actively directing the planes, although a signal seibin under the command of the Hikocho could wave off a plane if it was judged to be in a blatantly unsafe approach, or if the deck was fouled. Once in the final approach, the pilot established his glide slope. However, the Japanese also had a unique landing aid, Chakan Shido, landing guidance lights, to assist the pilot in setting up a safe approach. Originally, it had been intended for night landing purposes, but it had proven so useful that it was used in daytime as well. This device consisted of a bank of 2 red lights set at the level of the flight deck and a similar bank of 4 green lights set some 10-15 meters forward. First developed in 1932, each of the 1 kilowatt lights was variable in intensity and equipped with a mirror so as to emit a very narrow cone of illumination. Matched arrays were located on opposite sides of the ship. The angle of the lights was adjusted for each type of airplane. Attack planes typically came in at around a 5-degree slope, fighters perhaps a half-degree steeper than that. As the pilot descended, he attempted to make the lights line up so that the green lights were positioned immediately above the red. If the pilot could only see the red lights, i.e., he had fallen out of the cone of green light, he was below the correct slope. If the red lights were over the green, he was coming in so low that he would probably hit the ship's fantail. Likewise, if the green light was positioned far above the red, the pilot was coming in too high. As the plane approached the flight deck, he would eventually lose sight of the rear edge of the flight deck. However, Japanese carriers had white or red and white striped outrigger platforms near the aft end of the flight deck. These platforms helped the pilot gauge the orientation of the flight deck, even if the deck was obscured by the nose of the aircraft. At any point in the approach, the seibin could signal the pilot as to his condition. A red flag from the seibin signaled that the pilot should go around again. A white flag with an H meant that the aircraft's hook was not lowered. Each pilot aimed to keep his airspeed about 10 knots above stalling. For most aircraft, this meant maintaining between 70 and 75 knots. Lining up the final few seconds of the approach required excellent reflexes. In any sort of a crosswind, even a second's worth of inattention could mean putting the plane over the side and into the heavy steel netting that lined the flight deck. But if everything went properly, the pilot would cut his engine just before reaching the brightly painted fantail and then catch one of the arresting wires with his hook. Snagging the arresting wire was hardly a restful way to come to a halt, but it was not nearly as violent as the deceleration found on a post-war carrier jet. The Cure Type 4 arresting gear used at Midway had an induction coil drum below the flight deck, around which the arresting wires were spooled. The wires were held about 8 inches off the deck by a support that could be lowered flat when not in use. The Type 4 could stop a 4-ton aircraft travelling at a speed of 60 knots in less than 40 metres, applying about 2 Gs of deceleration in the process. As the first aircraft began approaching, the deck crewmen crouched in their tubs alongside the flight deck. This was where things could get really exciting. Landing accidents were not uncommon even under peacetime conditions, and with damaged aircraft and wounded pilots, the odds were good that somebody was going to crack up this morning. The most common mishap was the pilot missing the deck astern. Damaged landing gear from hard landings, hitting the island with a wing, and going over the side were not unheard of either. Another common accident was a barrier crash, wherein a plane would miss the landing wire and go hurtling into the crash barrier. Like the Americans, the Japanese used barriers to separate the after end of the flight deck, where landings were taking place, from the forward portion. If aircraft were parked forward, there would almost certainly be one or more barriers in place between them and the fantail, because a crash into a group of parked aircraft could have disastrous consequences. A typical crash barrier consisted of 3 athwartships, steel cables, upper, middle and lower, spanning the width of the flight deck. These were supported by poles that could be raised or lowered by compressed air in a matter of a few seconds. Such a barrier could stop a 4-ton aircraft travelling at a speed of 50 feet per second in a distance of less than 25 feet. Obviously, hitting the barrier at 4 Gs was hardly a love pat, and it often led to unpleasant consequences for the plane and pilot. Still, it was better than ploughing into one's squadron mates. As the planes came down, the deck crew prepared to receive them. Men with fire extinguishers were standing by, and any damaged plane could be swarmed almost instantly by dozens of rescuers. Japanese records do not record how many deck accidents occurred during the Tomonaga Force's landings, but there must have been some. According to Fuchida, a Kanko is known to have landed on one wheel on board Hiryu, which would have left the plane out of commission for certain, and a mortally wounded fighter pilot from Kaga, PO-1C Tanaka Yukuo, most likely crash-landed his as well. He died before he could be removed from the cockpit. Most of Tomonaga's men, however, landed successfully. The Japanese were certainly aided by the easy landing characteristics of their carrier aircraft, which had low stall speeds and forgiving handling. Not surprisingly, the Zero retained its responsiveness even at low speeds. But even the lumbering Type 97, in the opinion of one British test pilot who later flew it, had a docile stall and thus could be flown to its manoeuvre limits with impunity. All 3 aircraft also had good visibility over the nose, making control of the plane during the final approach much easier. As soon as each plane had been brought to a halt, deck crewmen rushed out to begin the stowage process. The pilot, or in the case of the Kanko and Kanbaku, the observer, would already be releasing the hook, and the crash barriers would be lowered on command from the Hikocho. By now, the deck crew had reached the plane and begun folding its wings. Time was of the essence. Already the next plane would be moving into position to land. The entire final approach, from the time of turn-in to landing on the deck, had taken about 20 seconds so far, and further time was needed to move the plane forward off of the arresting wires. During normal operations, the Japanese were able to land a plane every 25 to 45 seconds. As mentioned earlier, the Japanese avoided deck parks whenever possible. They believed that the hangar afforded more protection to the plane and crew. During landing, the Japanese shoved the newly landed aircraft forward of the crash barrier in preparation for taking the next one on board. Then, as soon as landing operations were completed, all planes were stowed below. It is likely that aircraft whose hangar locations were ahead of the barrier, such as fighters, were simply wheeled forward and stowed below immediately. However, for the Kanko in particular, whose typical storage spots were in the rear of the hangars, striking below had to wait until all aircraft were recovered. This technique, called Renzoku Shoryu, continuous recovery, of temporary deck parks and immediate stowage, had been a feature of Japanese carrier operations since the mid-1930s. However, this fixation on hangars had a definite downside, in that the stowage process was governed by elevator cycles. This necessarily retarded Japanese carrier flight operations in comparison to those of their American opposites who, in general, performed most refueling and rearming functions right on the flight deck. Not only did this restrict the flexibility of Japanese flight operations, but it also restricted the Japanese to performing dangerous rearming procedures within the confines of the ship. The practical consequences of this approach would become apparent in about an hour and a half. As Akagi's aircraft now came on board, the talk on her bridge was all about what to do after landing operations were completed. Nagumo had already sent word out at 0830 that the force's dive bombers should equip themselves with 250 kilos, i.e., semi-armor-piercing bombs. Having committed to dispatching the enemy task force, Nagumo chose to close with the enemy so as to ensure that Kid Butai's strike would be within range when his strike was prepared. Nagumo's decision may have also been informed by the desire to keep the wind on his bow. A northeastern course would allow him to conduct flight operations without breaking away from the enemy. At 0845, Tone Number 4 sent a new report. Sight what appears to be 2 additional enemy cruisers in position bearing 8 degrees, distance 250 miles from Midway. Nagumo apparently did not apprehend the true nature of this signal. Amari had sighted the fringes of a second American carrier group. Tone Number 4 did not know it, but they were observing Task Force 17. Coincidentally, at the same time that Amari's signal came in, Admiral Abe on board Tone signaled Captain Komura of Chikuma to send another Type 0 recon float plane to Amari's position. It was clear that Amari was not sending information along quickly enough. At 0850, Tone Number 4 again repeated that he was homeward bound, only to be told at 0854 that not only was he to stay where he was, but he was to activate his radio transmitter and keep it on so that the fleet could home in on him for direction-finding purposes. What Amari thought of this order cannot be known, but it should have been apparent that Nagumo wasn't pleased with his performance thus far. The fact that he was now being expected to broadcast his position, which the Americans could pick up just as easily as his compatriots, could not have been a welcome order. However, he quickly acknowledged its receipt at 855 and added that 10 enemy torpedo aircraft, Yorktown's newly launched strike force, were headed toward Kid Butai.